Hello, in this video, I'm going to continue the conversation that I started in the last video talking about Black Marxism on the water resolution. I think that the really interesting part about what this kind of set of videos would do is that I think it'll really lay out a different type of way of thinking about the place of things like the cap K, and also a really interesting way for you to think about, I think, what some of the central claims are going to be for a lot of the teams that are kind of moving closer to the left on this topic. And I think that really starting off this series with the question of just what is the role of Black Marxism on the negative versus policy team and what the kind of like ideal structure for that looks like is a really good place for us to just begin with like some of the foundational arguments that you're really going to need in order to kind of like be really persuasive and useful on this particular type of resolution. If you haven't, you should definitely watch the intro to Black Marxism water video that I did just before, kind of explaining I think some of the more foundational arguments and places that I'll be using in order to kind of like push what I think are some of like the more central principles and like ideologies that you kind of need to understand in order to make these arguments, and also what I thought were some of like the key ways that you can kind of read this argument on the affirmative and the negative in order to kind of think of what are kind of some of the base ways that you really want to frame this argument on the water resolution, which will help kind of frame the way that we start to kind of like more specifically do a lot of these videos that kind of frame what the Black Marxism and on the water resolution will look like in various types of situations. And what I want to start with here in terms of just talking about like what this type of criticism will look like and what your priorities should be. I think when you're thinking about like what the priorities for what this argument should look like and what the strengths and weaknesses of it are, I think the really good thing about the Black Marxism criticism is that it allows you to make really strong arguments about like why there are like such strong connections between like why there's an investment between the states in order to like the continued private kind of investments into water as a whole and into water protections, and why the kind of like increased of like public basically interaction with the ability to kind of persuade or change legality over water protections kind of like basically invest in for the privatization of water, because I think that the way that you kind of want to shape a lot of the arguments that are made often with the writing of people that we cited like in the original video is that they kind of like explain how, for instance, in the context of places like Flint, the idea of the ways in which even local and state governments kind of draw out their municipal plans for how they're kind of organizing state budgets is that there are pacts that are made between private corporations that are able to also make investments into like various local prisons and other forms of local infrastructure in order to allow like the increased kind of like experimentation of like various types of water sources, and the increased kind of like basically the lowering of the standards for like what types of water standards need to be kept in different types of environments and communities. I think that kind of blending and looking at some of these different cases and applying them to some of the core mechanisms for how the water resolution functions could be really interesting as applications for how the idea of some type of like recuperation of that through the law requires basically a separation of the state and it's kind of like central tied to private corporations and privatization as a structure of how we think about the implementation of law. And I think that doing so would require like basically a really fundamental shift in the way that like policymakers are like forced to think about what priorities are made in their policy decisions and how the kind of like losses that are made in the face of this are recuperated by other types of municipal programs. Because I think the other thing that racial capitalism and like carceral capitalism is good at talking about on like the prisons resolution, if you debate on that resolution, and what I think is still pertinent here is the idea that these institutions are able to use things like prisons and other ways of kind of like municipal debt in order to kind of recuperate the value that is lost by investing in the safety and infrastructure and other institutions. And so I think that trying to pull examples of how that relates to the types of programs that are created in relationship to water and how it requires a kind of reinvestment into capitalism could be a really interesting way for you to frame the type of arguments that you'll want to make for this type of criticism, and overall I think really push for why there's a kind of central tension to the usage of the state as a whole, and then there's a kind of necessity of a differential approach to the types of like control that various types of corporations are still able to pull over water sources that are integral to the survival of various communities. I think that there's the only weakness of this is that I think there are a lot of really interesting evidence that people have kind of like already shown early on in like some of like the summer research, etc., that really shows that a lot of authors are talking about specific policies are really focused in on trying to answer the question of like why these policies are so influential and how we think about the role that like capitalism and neoliberalism play in how we also think about like race and racism, in particular in the context of water for specific policies. But I think that the kind of like idea that whether or not they address them or say that they kind of like talk about the idea of like the investment of capitalism, that really making this kind of investment in a larger structural criticism and making arguments about how the alternative, depending on the framing of that you take up for the debate, is a better option in order to resolve a lot of the questions that you have for how to defy capitalism in these particular debates, could be a net better way for you to kind of like move over and reduce the access that a lot of these teams have to actually using these evidence and kind of use it against them instead of it feeling like a weapon against you, which hopefully a lot of these other videos will kind of be able to help explain. I think that when you're generally thinking about the framing kind of portion for the debate, the first thing that you really want to think about is how can you set an interpretation for the debate that allows you to really contest the affirmative both on the kind of like epistemological level and the way that it like desires a particular usage of state-based scenario planning in order to think about what type of like options we have for like resisting against capitalism, but also to like think about it at a functional level as well in order to really weigh the kind of like material implications of the way in which they're kind of invested in a particular usage of the environment and a particular investment in the United States' ability to kind of like redistribute the kind of like land that is already, you know, taken via dispossession, that is like only able to be insured, developed on, and industrialized through processes of slave labor, etc. And what I think like a really strong racial capitalism criticism does, especially at the framing and the thesis level, is that it's able to really make a core argument about why the central recognition of that kind of like control over land and water as illegitimate means that the response and the usage of the state is already a non-starter for the conversation. And I think then at the framing and thesis level, you really have a central contention with why the particular mechanism that the affirmative is taking up to respond to the resolution already invests in a particular relationship that you're problematizing about the very institution that's attempting to produce water protections. And thus I think you have a lot more arguments about like why there is a necessity for kind of an alternative formation in terms of what resistance looks like to those types of institutions. I think that it's incredibly important for you to be able to center these types of like thesis questions and how you're how you're able to make your offense altogether, because when you're able to really make such a strong critique of the state in whatever way it moves, it makes it a lot harder for teams to kind of weigh the unique factor of being able to make liberal spins out of like the plan text that they're offering, because the problematic that you're taking from the earlier on the debate is like the foundational basis that the state can kind of be a legitimate source in order to like plan the types of things that can even like attribute to a redistribution of water in such a way that is efficient for the communities that are being addressed. Hopefully this video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll continue to more videos I'll be doing talking about Black Marxism and water. And yeah, thanks for tuning in.